The Kentucky Derby is the greatest horse race in the world. But it's more than a horse race. It's an amazing creation that seems almost divinely inspired. It is a mystical celebration of horses and humanity, which is as much a part of Kentucky's identity as the bluegrass itself. So how does one explain the Kentucky Derby? Held annually at Louisville's Churchill Downs on the first Saturday in May, the Derby has become an institution, a tradition, even a way of life for some folks. But it wasn't always that way. Less than a century and a half ago, the Kentucky Derby was nothing more than an idea. In the years following the Civil War, America was on the move. The country was joined by the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. The internal combustion engine and the telephone both made their debut. And Edison's revolutionary incandescent lamp would soon be introduced to the world at the Southern Exposition in Louisville. New sports were also being invented. The first college football game between Rutgers and Princeton universities was played in 1869. This was also the year of the first professional baseball game. And horse racing was evolving in America from impromptu match races into a spectator sport. But many parts of the United States were still suffering from the disastrous effects of the Civil War. The conflict had taken its toll in Kentucky. Horse farms had been raided and bloodstock stolen. Even after the war, guerrilla bands in Army uniforms plundered Kentucky thoroughbred farms. And in the state's largest city, Louisville, the centuries-old sport of horse racing had died out. In 1872, a group of interested horsemen approached a prominent 26-year-old Louisvillian, Meriwether Lewis Clark, Jr. Would he be willing to help resurrect the sport of kings in Louisville? Clark, grandson of the famous explorer William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, readily accepted the challenge. But his background was in banking, not horse racing. Clark set off for Europe on a fact-finding tour. He learned the French wagering system called Paris Mutuals, and in England experienced such celebrated races as the Ascot Gold Cup and the St. Leger Stakes. But what impressed him most was the tradition-rich Epsom Derby. Clark returned to Louisville full of new ideas. He proposed an annual stakes race patterned after the Epsom Derby. With $32,000 in capital, a site was selected for the track several miles south of downtown Louisville on land owned by Clark's two uncles, John and William Henry Churchill. By the spring of 1875, the track was graded and a small wooden clubhouse and grandstand, as well as barns, were built. At the Louisville Jockey Club, eventually to be known as Churchill Downs, the stage was set for history's first Kentucky Derby. From the outset, the local press predicted success for the Kentucky Derby. Clark claimed that in a decade, a Derby-winning horse would be worth more to the owner than the farm the horse is raised on. But Clark was no idle braggart. And what a Derby it was.
The Derby got started on the right foot. The 1875 Derby, the inaugural Derby, was a festive occasion, and it was a great day for racing. Aristides won the Derby. Chesapeake was supposed to win it as stablemate. And it just goes to show the very first Derby had the unpredictability of the race, that it didn't pan out the way H. Price McGrath, the owner of Aristides and Chesapeake, thought it would. Good jockeys, good trainers. It was everything Colonel Clark, the founder of the Derby, wanted it to be.
The first Kentucky Derby saw two kinds of wagering. Auction pools, and thanks to Clark's European tour, a new kind of betting, Paris Mutuals, later to be known as Paramutuals, allowed bettors to wager as little as $5 on any horse they liked. Thus, the odds were determined by the bettors themselves. Colonel Clark was also instrumental in making the Derby a social affair, an event as much for the ladies as for the gentlemen. He was an upstanding track judge who adhered strictly to the rules, and it often got him in trouble. In 1879, Captain T.G. Moore, a horseman from Crab Orchard, Kentucky, became enraged when Colonel Clark refused to allow his horses to run in a stakes race until he'd paid his entry fee. Convinced that he'd been grievously insulted, Captain Moore shot Colonel Clark with a pistol at the Galt House in Louisville. Fortunately for Colonel Clark and the Derby, the wound was not fatal. Colonel Clark's influence lasted until 1894, when the Louisville Jockey Club was sold. Although he continued as the track's presiding judge, he became chronically ill. In 1899, despondent and in failing health, he took his own life.
He envisioned great things for the Derby from the very beginning. He was just the right man to come along, and he did it the right way. I think he would be right proud of what happened, though, because really it was Colonel Clark who started this whole thing off.
Along with Colonel Clark and Churchill Downs investors, there was another group that was essential to the Derby's success, the jockeys. And almost without exception, they were African Americans. There had been a long tradition of horsemanship in Africa. In the United States, a new equestrian tradition was established among the African American slaves.
The slave owners sought to purchase particular slaves, those that had certain skills. From that point, you can imagine that with the growth of thoroughbred racing and tracks popping up next to plantations, that some of the Africans who were in captivity and enslaved in the United States would naturally have been access to ride the horses because they were caretaking the horses. They were producing some of the veterinary medicine in the early years out of their own knowledge of herbs and medicines in Africa.
Thus it was that thoroughbred owners called upon the best riders, many of them African American horsemen, to wear their silks in races. After the Civil War, African American jockeys rode as freedmen. During this time, the top thoroughbred racehorses were bred and trained at a few legendary central Kentucky farms, attracting many of the most talented African American riders and trainers of the day.
Slavery was over. It wasn't a question of African American riders not having any choice because they were enslaved. And still we see that 14 of the 15 jockeys in the first Derby were African American. That's quite impressive.
By the first decade of the 20th century, jockeys' status and their earnings had increased. At the same time, training moved from farms to the tracks, where racism was on the rise. As increasing numbers of Euro-American jockeys were attracted to racing, Afro-American jockeys would disappear from the scene. Before the era closed, however, many African-American jockeys achieved prominence. Men like Billy Walker, who won the Derby in 1877. Willie Sims and Jimmy Winkfield, who were both two-time Derby winners. And Edward Dudley Brown, who was also a premier owner and trainer. Jockey Isaac Murphy's 3 Kentucky Derby victories were unrivaled for almost half a century. Murphy finished his jockeying career with an amazing record, winning 628 of just over 1,400 races run.
Isaac Murphy was known as the jockey of all jockeys. He was quite a gentleman. He was a very good investor. Eddie Arcaro breaks a record that Isaac Murphy sets in the 1890s. That's a stunning record.
By the mid-1880s, the Derby was in full bloom. 8 of the first 11 races featured horses which were regarded as the best in their age group. In 1886, the influential James Ben Ali Hagan won the Kentucky Derby. Hagan had a problem with the bookmakers, or to be exact, the lack of them.
He was upset over the fact that there weren't bookmakers on the track that day. The bookmakers had gone on strike. Mr. Hagen was trying to impress all the people he brought in here. He wanted to bet through the bookmakers. This was his way of doing it. He let his feelings be known, and one of the directors expressed the opinion that the Churchill Downs could do without Ben a la Hagen. And once that got back to him, he pulled his stable out the next day. He went back to the east and put the word out on the Kentucky Derby, how he was treated down here. And for 3 decades almost, the Derby had to overcome this boycott of the eastern stables of the Kentucky Derby.
In 1894, a group of Louisvillians put up the money to buy what would be called the new Louisville Jockey Club. Louisville society had lost interest in the track, and it was thought a new facility would draw them back. The track was reconfigured, and a new grandstand with twin spires was built on the opposite side of the track. Nearby, they constructed a huge betting shed. In 1896, the length of the Derby was changed from 1.5 miles to the 1.25 miles it is today, which attracted faster horses and many more Derby nominees. At the end of that race, the most enduring symbol of the Derby was quietly born, as roses were presented to the winner. Still, none of these changes was enough to pull the track and the Derby out of a slump.
And then at the turn of the century, the Derby, I mean, it's hard to believe, but the Derby was on the jeopardy of extinction. And that's where Colonel Wynn came in.
Martin Joseph Wynn saw the first Kentucky Derby as a young boy from the back of his father's grocery cart. He attended every succeeding Derby for the next 3/4 of a century. Eventually, Matt Wynn became a merchant tailor, but he was no ordinary tailor. He made political and social acquaintances that would change his life. He, in turn, would help secure the future of the Kentucky Derby. In 1903, under new management, a new clubhouse and a bandstand were added. Wynn was to run the concessions and summer events. To survive, the sport of horse racing also had to become a successful business. Matt Wynn's promotional ability propelled him to the top. He would soon become general manager as well as vice president. And most importantly, he would attract to Louisville the all-powerful Eastern Racing Establishment.
Well, the Eastern Racing Establishment was where the horses were. That's where the people were that owned the horses, so his ability to go up there and convince them that they should bring their horses to Kentucky and specifically Louisville was the crucial thing to the success of the Derby.
In 1911, with New York racing in the midst of a temporary blackout, R.F. Carman sent his Kentucky-bred colt Meridian to the Derby and won. The next year, it was New York's pride, a horse named Worth. And in 1913, an outsider, Donerail, won the Derby, paying a record $184.90. Colonel Wynn made sure the story was reported coast to coast.
Colonel Wynn brought charisma, promotional ability, a personality, a love of the race. He was able to communicate with racing riders, with horsemen. He was the right person to come along at the right time.
He made an imprint on the race itself, and I think that the race and his personality are almost one and the same now.
In the first exciting decade of a new century, Americans were enthralled by unheard of technical advances, many of which were in evidence at Churchill Downs. In 1910, 7 years after the Wright brothers had invented the flying machine, Kentucky's first recorded airplane flight took place from the infield of Churchill Downs. In 1913, as Henry Ford began mass-producing Model Ts, some 2,000 autos conveyed Derby fans to the Downs. In a few years, that figure would triple. In 1914, when the starter cracked his whip, a wonder horse named Old Rosebud bolted down the track. He won the Derby by an impressive 8 lengths, with a record-breaking time of 2 minutes, 3 2/5 seconds. The next year was pivotal for the Kentucky Derby and Colonel Wynn. For virtually the first time since 1886, and at the end of a temporary ban on New York racing, the Easterners were back. Some 40 to 50,000 race fans made their way to Churchill Downs. And among the record's 16-horse field, double the usual size, was a lone filly named Regret. The thoroughbred record gushed, "We shall never forget her gorgeous appearance on that memorable afternoon in May. She stepped out on the course looking every inch a queen and receiving an ovation of which even royalty might have been proud." But Regret had more than looks. She had speed.
Harry Payne Whitney, the owner and breeder of Regret, stood on the track afterward and said what Colonel Wynn himself couldn't have said in better words. He said, "If she never wins another race, it doesn't matter. She's won the greatest race in America, the Kentucky Derby." And after that, there was no problem whatsoever in ever bringing the Eastern horses in or the riders. Great horses ran in the Derby from 1913 to 1915. Old Rosebud is a Hall of Fame horse. He won the 1914 Derby. Regret in 1915, she went on to the Hall of Fame. In 1918, Exterminator, he won 50 of 100 career starts. The first Triple Crown winner was Sir Barton in 1919. It was not recognized until later on. So during that period, you had great horses win the Derby, and the Derby, first and foremost, has to have great horses. It had to have it to get over the hump. And during that time, it was getting the very best horses.
With the First World War at an end, the 20s roared onto the scene. It was a time of rapid change for the nation. Prohibition came and went. Women finally won their hard-earned struggle to vote. And an invention called radio was sweeping the country. In 1925, for the first time, radio listeners heard the Kentucky Derby broadcast from one of the Twin Spires. That same year, a number of Derby guests arrived in a new way, by airplane. And maybe most importantly, by the mid-20s, New York sports writer and future Churchill Downs president Bill Corum coined an expression that would forever after be a synonym for the Kentucky Derby. He called it the Run for the Roses. The Roaring '20s were a time of excess in America, a time of big profits, big spenders, and big gamblers. And no one gambled bigger than Colonel E.R. Bradley.
He was a great man to work for. He was well respected throughout the racing industry. And he was a gambler. He loved to bet. He would bet on anything.
And with the names of 2 of his best horses beginning with the first letter of his own name, the superstitious Colonel Bradley set a precedent.
He named all his horses with the first letter B's. They call him the Lucky B's because he did seem to have incredible luck.
Bradley's magnificent Idle Hour farm produced a slew of Lucky Bees who became Kentucky Derby contestants, and 3 who won. Broker's Tip in '33, Bubbling Over in '26, and Behave Yourself in '21. Colonel Bradley, of course, wasn't the only one in the Kentucky Derby limelight during the '20s. There was Al Jolson, star of vaudeville, as well as the exciting new talking picture, The Jazz Singer, and famous oil man Harry F. Sinclair, whose horse Zev ran in the 1923 Derby. Many Kentuckians laughed when Zev came to town. Ironically, neither Sinclair nor Zev's trainer, Sam Hildreth, had enough faith in their horse to show up for the race. If they had, they'd have seen the first Derby to start from the head of the stretch for a fairer start to the race. Zev was ridden by a brilliant jockey, Earl Sandy, who took Zev to an early lead and never looked back. He won the Derby by 1.5 lengths and paid $40.40 for those lucky enough to have bet on him. The decade of the 30s saw Derby records equaled and excelled. With Burgoo King in 1932, Colonel Bradley became the first racehorse owner to win 3 Kentucky Derbies. But one of the most amazing Derby stretch battles of that or any decade occurred in 1933, the year Colonel Bradley won with the legendary Broker's Tip in what would become known as the Fighting Finish.
In 1933, Broker's Tip came into the Derby, a maiden. He'd never won a race. He would never win another race. He's the only Derby winner whose only win in his life came in the Kentucky Derby. Broker's Tip had been making a move through the inside the whole way and was coming up on the inside. Herb Fisher moved his horse over to the inside. He was going to put Broker's Tip in close quarters. He had no intent to hit the horse because he didn't want any kind of an accident. He just wanted to make it tight on Broker's Tip. Don Meade, the jockey on Broker's Tip, saw head play coming in over on him. He didn't know what Herb Fisher had up his sleeve, so he instinctively reached out and pushed him away. He was the first offender, but once that started, they're reaching over, grabbing each other, pulling. You had a tug-of-war coming down the stretch.
The decade leading up to World War II had not been good to America. The 1929 stock market crash had plunged the country deep into depression, and the Kentucky Derby did not escape its effects. Betting on the 1933 Derby was the lowest in 15 years. And in 1934, the Derby purse was cut from $50,000 to $30,000. But even the Depression couldn't keep the Derby down. The 1930s saw great races as well as many technical advances.
The Derby was growing up. 1930 was the first Derby ever using the stall gate. 1930 also was the first year the public address announcer was out of Churchill Downs. 1936 was the first year for the photo finish camera. So you started to see changes along those lines.
The 1930s also saw a new term come into use, the Triple Crown. It is bestowed upon the horse that wins the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont Stakes.
Sonny Jim Fitzsimmons there in the 1930s won 2 Triple Crowns. One with Gallon Fox in 1930, and then in 1935 with a son of Gallon Fox named Omaha. And then in 1939, he won the Kentucky Derby with Johnstown. In 1937, you had another Triple Crown winner named War Admiral, who was the son of Man of War. There were more and more good horses to come along.
The 30s also saw the rise of another legendary Kentucky Derby character, Benjamin Allen Jones, better known as Plain Ben. But he was anything but plain when it came to training horses. Plain Ben already had the 1938 Derby winner under his belt when he made a move that was to affect both him and the Kentucky Derby for years to come. In 1939, he went to work for Warren Wright Sr., head of the up-and-coming Lexington-based Calumet Farm empire. Together, the team would win no less than 4 Derbies.
In 1941, Calumet Farm had Ben Jones training, they had Eddie Arquero riding, and they had a horse called Whirlaway, who was famous for his come-from-behind finishing kicks, and the public loved him. He was known as Mr. Longtail. Whirlaway was a headstrong horse. He wanted things done his way, and Calumet Farm needed a strong jockey, and they brought in Eddie Arquero. They also devised a one-eyed blinker where Whirlaway's vision would be limited so that he wouldn't bolt at the top of the stretch. And the story was that they tested this out before the Derby, and then they won the Kentucky Derby by 8 lengths.
Whirlaway's victory set a Churchill Downs track record that was to last for 21 years, and he went on to win the Triple Crown. Like everywhere in wartime America, times were tough in Louisville. Wartime shortages meant doing without items Americans had come to take for granted, such as transportation. In 1942, many of the special Derby trains to Louisville were canceled. As the transportation situation became even more dire, the U.S. Department of Defense let it be known the nation might be better off without a 1943 Kentucky Derby.
Colonel Wynn wouldn't stand for any talk like that, and he said if there were just 2 or 3 of us in the grandstand, we're going to run the Kentucky Derby. Those derbies during the wartime years, 43 and 44, were called the streetcar derbies because people were encouraged not to drive their cars to the racetrack, to go out in streetcars. Out-of-town people were encouraged not to come in for the Derby. Those tickets were given to soldiers at Fort Knox or Louisvillians. And the crowds at those derbies were for the most part made up of Louisvillians and soldiers. The 1943 Derby was won by Count Fleet. Some old-timers will say he was the greatest racehorse of all time. He was sired by a Kentucky Derby winner, Ray Count, who won the 1928 Derby. Count Fleet later sired a Derby winner named Count Turf, who won in 1951. Johnny Longden rode Count Fleet, was a Hall of Fame jockey, won thousands of races in his career, and always maintained this was the greatest horse he ever saw. Better than Secretariat, better than any of them.
By 1945, the Defense Department became more restrictive and slapped a wartime ban on racing. Germany surrendered on May 8th, and the Derby was run a month late that year, but run it did. 3 years later, in 1948, Eddie Arcaro would be the first jockey to break Isaac Murphy's record by winning his 4th Kentucky Derby.
1948 brought the Calumet Farm entry of Cotown, who was unbeaten, and Citation. They finished 1-2, Calumet Farm won it with Citation, Cotown was second. Eddie Arcaro wasn't convinced before the race. He was on Citation, but he heard so much talk from Kentucky Hard Boots about Cotown and how great he looked in winning the Bluegrass Stakes. And he went up to Ben Jones and said, Ben, am I on the right horse? And Ben Jones said, Eddie, if I thought Cotown was a better horse, you'd be on Cotown. Citation had no holes in him. He could do anything. He could sprint, he could run long, bad track, good track, carry weight, you name it, he could do it.
Along with many other post-war developments, in 1948, television arrived, forever altering the way Americans saw their world, including the Kentucky Derby. The first live, nationally televised Derby in 1952 was a thrilling affair, as Eddie Arcaro scored his 5th Derby win on Calumet's Hillgale. But it was the 1953 Kentucky Derby that was the real nail-biter. With that year began the decades of the dancers.
In 1953, Native Dancer came along. He was unbeaten. He would lose 1 race in his career when I came up in the 1953 Derby. Native Dancer was bumped on the clubhouse turn. He had to regain his momentum. He came back in the upper stretch and started making up ground on Dark Star, but Dark Star was able to hold on and beat him in an exciting finish. Native Dancer went on to win the Preakness in Belmont and was a Horse of the Year the next year.
Did the bump cost Native Dancer the Triple Crown? No one will ever know for sure. But Native Dancer got even as a stud. His descendants have included quite a few Derby winners, among them Northern Dancer in '64 and Kauai King in '66. But before we leave the 1950s, 3 more spectacular derbies must be mentioned.
The 1957 Derby brought together the greatest field in the history of the Kentucky Derby. In that race, there was Bold Ruler, who would be the 1957 Horse of the Year. There was Round Table, who would be the 1958 Horse of the Year. There was Gallant Man, who would win the Belmont Stakes that year. A horse entered in that Derby named General Duke, who, had he been able to finish his career, might have been the greatest horse ever to represent Calumet Farm. There was Federal Hill, a tremendously fast racehorse. And there was Iron Liege, who was probably the 3rd or 4th best horse in that field, but on that day ran the race of his life to win the Kentucky Derby. Coming down the stretch, Iron Leach had the lead, and as he approached the 16th pole, Gallant Man was coming on in a big move, and Bill Shoemaker stood up instantly, just for an instant, in the saddle. He thought the 16th pole was the finish line. When he realized his mistake, he went back to riding, but he wasn't able to overcome Iron Leach. Iron Leach won by a nose.
The next year, a star arrived from the West Coast 3 weeks before the Derby at Churchill Downs. This prima donna had his own press agent, he received fan mail, and the TV cameras followed his every move. His name, Silky Sullivan.
Silky Sullivan was a horse that came from way out of it, and when I say way out of it, he would drop sometimes 40 lengths back and then make up this tremendous deficit right at the finish of a race. He was known as the Red Comet, the greatest Sullivan since John L. He was featured in magazines, but it made for tremendous copy, and just the way he would be flying at the end of these races. He was a beautiful racehorse. If he were in a beauty contest, he would have won that, but he was in a horse race, and when the Derby came up in '58, the track was heavy. His trainer later said he couldn't handle a heavy track. What he couldn't handle was the competition in the Kentucky Derby. And Silky Sullivan finished 12th. He beat 2 horses, one of whom was pulled up. Still made for a great story. There's never been anything like Silky Sullivan in the history of the Kentucky Derby.
There were no California stars like Silky Sullivan at the 1959 Derby, at least not on the racetrack. But this horse race produced a cliffhanger more exciting than anything coming out of Hollywood.
The 1959 Derby, in my opinion, was the greatest stretch battle in Derby history. You had Tommy Lee and Sword Dancer, and they had been side by side even before they turned into the home stretch. At the top of the stretch, Sword Dancer was making a move, and Shoemaker thought Sword Dancer was going to pull off and leave him, and yelled over to Bill Boland, the jockey of Sword Dancer, "Good luck, go get it." And at that point, Tommy Lee dug in again, and it was a bumping finish coming down the stretch. That was one of the greatest rides in the history of the Kentucky Derby, because once Tommy Lee dug back in, Bill Shoemaker wasn't going to let that horse lose. He practically carried him over the finish line, won by a nose. An extremely close finish.
In the midst of a turbulent decade of change, the Kentucky Derby survived and thrived. There was one tradition, though, that seemed to have expired, winning the Triple Crown. Since Citation in 1948, American horse racing's noblest title had gone unclaimed.
There were some people who said, well, there'll never be another Triple Crown winner. We were never going to see another one. Kerry back in '61 won the Derby by coming from way out of it. He won the Preakness with a tremendous charge in the last 16th. He was odds on to win the Belmont. He didn't win the race. He finished up the track. In '64, Northern Dancer won the first 2 legs, lost the Belmont. In '66, Kauai King won the first 2 legs, lost the Belmont. In '68, Forward Pass won the 2 legs, but he lost the Belmont. In '69, Majestic Prince, the unbeaten horse based in California, won the Derby and Preakness, lost the Belmont. We had seen so many of these horses come along who came close to winning the Triple Crown, and they weren't able to do it. Finally, in 1973, Secretariat was able to end that drought, 25 years without a Triple Crown winner.
Secretariat was a big, beautiful horse, and he was widely favored to win the 1973 Derby. He had been syndicated for over $6 million, a record by Seth Hancock of Claiborne Farm. And the pressure on his trainer, Lucien Lauren, was unprecedented.
They're at the post.
But then again, Secretariat himself was without precedent.
And they're on.
He did something, though, that you're not supposed to do as a racehorse, going a mile and a quarter in the Kentucky Derby. He ran each quarter progressively faster. It's supposed to be the other way around. The farther you go, human, animal, or whatever, the tireder you become. With him, though, the farther he went, the faster he ran. The greatest racehorse I've ever seen.
Secretariat's chief rival was Sham, who had finished ahead of him earlier that spring in the Wood Memorial. And Secretariat was out for revenge. With his blazing 1:59 and 2/5 time, Secretariat won the race, establishing a long-standing track record. In the same Derby, Sham ran the second fastest Derby of all time. He, too, broke Northern Dancer's record of 2 minutes flat. Secretariat wasn't finished, though. He polished off the Preakness 2 weeks later. And then, just like would-be Triple Crown winners before him, Secretariat faced the Belmont. For the past 25 years, a jinx of a horse race. It was one incredible performance to top off 3 incredible horse races. Secretariat, or Big Red as he was called, blazed down the track, winning by 31 lengths and smashing the Belmont record by over 2 seconds. It had taken a quarter of a century for a new horse to attain the Triple Crown. But just 4 years later, the elusive title was conferred on another speedster of the 1970s, Seattle Slew.
The only unbeaten horse ever to win the Triple Crown. He should have lost the Kentucky Derby. He came out of the gate sideways. They go a quarter of a mile. He overcomes that, and he's fighting for the lead. He bullied his way through, bumped horses, did whatever it took to get him up there. But after expending that much energy and fighting to get to the lead, you would expect a horse to give out at some point. Instead of doing that, he drove for the moment into the ground, put away the speed, turned for home, and then still had enough left to hold off the stretch runners.
By 1978, the nation had come down with a severe case of Triple Crown fever, and 2 arch rivals, Affirmed and Alydar, provided just the cure. They called it the Battle of the Giants, the greatest rivalry in racing history. Alydar was ridden by George Velasquez, Affirmed by 18-year-old Steve Cawthon, who had been the leading apprentice jockey just 2 years earlier.
I started on a small farm called Liberty Hill, and that's really where I started galloping horses on the farm. They had it wasn't so much a track as basically a big plowed area around a cornfield. You know, I can't say how important that experience was for me, because as much as we were teaching the horses, I was learning twice as much. In the beginning, when I would come to the Derby, my parents would bring my brother and I to the backside. We'd watch the race from there, and one of the years, a friend of ours, Lonnie Abshire, who had taken the winning horse to the post, retrieved one of the roses from the blanket of roses, and he gave it to me. I guess at that stage was when I really gained a knowledge of what a great event it was. The Derby is such an event, and with all the atmosphere, so much noise, so many distractions, it's a scary experience in a sense, but horses like Affirmed or Secretariat tend to be horses that can rise above all the distractions, and they have to focus specifically on their job at hand. And I think that the great horses are so professional in what they do. They love racing, and they don't get frightened by noises as much as some of the other horses do. It's a wonderful feeling walking down the stretch, hearing my old Kentucky home, especially being a Kentucky boy. That was very important to me. I knew I was walking into an experience that I had been looking forward to all my life, and was just lucky enough to have the chance to experience. When you touch the dirt on the track, when the horse steps onto it, you have a feeling of, right at this moment, everybody, including yourself, is looking to see if your horse and you are going to be good enough, if you're going to come up to the challenge. It's a feeling of, can I do it? Can we do it? I recall walking into the starting gate. My horse was number 2, so I was the second one in, and I had to wait for all the other horses to be loaded. And it just seemed like slow motion. I was really aware of every sound and thing that was going on, and the calls of the stall handlers helping to get the horses in, calling to the starter to say, not now, sir. And It's hard to explain the feeling, but it was a burst of, here we go, you know, whatever's going to come up, I don't know, but we're loose now, you know, let's see. The power that you felt sitting on top of him was an unbelievable power at any time, but in the Derby, with everything that was riding, you know, that is always riding on the Kentucky Derby, and the emotion and the excitement and the 200,000 people and everything else, it was just a great thing to be a part of that race.
Affirmed toward the rail and down the stretch they come. Affirmed on the inside, takes command again.
The great thing, as always, was that when it came time to ask Affirmed to push the button, as they say, there was plenty in reserve, and the horse had it to give and wanted to give it, and that's a great feeling.
Two weeks later in the Preakness, Affirmed again beat Alydar, this time by only a neck. And in the Belmont, Affirmed and Alydar clashed in one of the greatest horse racing battles of all time.
They hooked up with about 7 furlongs to go, these two 3-year-olds, going a mile and a half. And they battled it out the rest of the way, and coming down the stretch, it was the most exciting thing I've ever seen in all of sports.
Affirmed's courage, you know, came through, and he gave that extra effort, and that's what made the difference in me winning or losing that day.
The rivalry couldn't have been more closely matched. Affirmed won the Belmont by a head, and the entire Triple Crown by a combined margin of less than 2 lengths.
If he was a human being, he would have been good in every sport. He would have been a basketball player, a football player. He could do it all, and as an all-around athlete and a professional, he was just by far and away the best I ever rode.
The next year, 1979, a spectacular horse named Spectacular Bid won the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness. He seemed to cinch to win the coveted Triple Crown, but lost the Belmont.
But he came back the next year, was unbeaten as a 4-year-old, 1980, best horse in America. He was a great racehorse. So I think from beginning to end, the 70s, they truly were the golden age of racing.
When people come here, they get caught up in the atmosphere of the Derby. The whole city has just become a backdrop for the Derby. And the time of the year is also important. Got the dogwoods out, the parties given, the mint juleps and the food. There's just nothing that goes on that week that isn't exciting to be around. I've always said if you don't like Louisville at Derby time, you won't like Louisville.
In the 80s, under the direction of chairman of the board Warner Jones and President Tom Meeker, Churchill Downs underwent one of the most extensive renovations in its history. With a new turf track, new and restored facilities, and revitalized business operations, Churchill Downs started into its 2nd century in grand style. Over the century, Derby crowds have grown as steadily as its purses. But one of the biggest crowd pleasers in all of Derby history took to the field in 1980. She was a filly named Genuine Risk.
To me, every Derby is a fascinating story, but in the 80s, you had Genuine Risk, the first filly since Regret to win the Kentucky Derby. I remember I used to watch some of those Derbies next to Mike Berry, the old-time Louisville sports writer, and I remember after the 1980 Derby, we stood there and watched Genuine Risk win the Derby, and afterward we just shook hands. We'd seen a filly win the Kentucky Derby in our lifetime. You know, I didn't know that that was ever going to happen.
Another crowd pleaser was not a horse, but a jockey, a fellow they called the Little Man. In 1986, Bill Shoemaker, at age 54, became the oldest jockey ever to win the Kentucky Derby.
A lot of people, and I was one of them, thought that Shoemaker would be a liability, actually, on Ferdinand, that he was too old, that he wouldn't take the chances. Instead, he went for a hole in the upper part of the stretch and won the Kentucky Derby. Trained by Charlie Whittingham, who was the oldest trainer to ever win the Derby. 3 years later, he would win it again with Sunday Silence.
Ferdinand under Bill Shoemaker wins the Derby by 2.
But even as Bill Shoemaker and other Kentucky Derby legends left the spotlight, new ones moved into its brilliance. Jockeys such as the talented young Steve Cawthon and trainers such as D. Wayne Lucas came on the scene. A new group of celebrity owners, always objects of intense media and public fascination, has taken its place on the Derby stage. And in a welcome, if ironic, historical twist, African Americans are returning to horse racing and to the Derby spotlight. That is, after all, the nature of an enduring tradition. It retains and revives the best of the past while evolving confidently into the future.
I saw my first Derby in 1938. My father took me, and we parked on the backside and came through the infield. And I thought the horses were the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. I'd never dreamt I'd be a horse trainer, obviously. But there's a little niche for everybody in this world. A doctor or a lawyer or a brick mason or a fireman, a policeman or a horseman. And for some reason I fell into this horse thing, having not been qualified when I was young. But it was a dream, and a dream came true. And I still think that the horse is the most beautiful animal in the world. There's nothing comparable to it.
I've got a very poor record at picking the Kentucky Derby winner, but on Wednesday of Derby week, I don't think this will ever happen again. I told my wife I just saw the Kentucky Derby winner today. And I've never said that before. I don't think I'll ever say it again. I'll never feel that way. You could just sense that they knew this horse was on top of a big race. He was coming into his own.
About Wednesday or Thursday, I began to feel more comfortable with the horse. And I had a private thought that we were not going to be disgraced.
I guess the older I get, the more I realize that what I'm about to see is history. The next 2 minutes before the Derby, and I get a real nervous feeling in my stomach beforehand, I'm going to see something that people are going to read about 100 years from now. It's about to happen right here in front of my own eyes, and I don't want to miss anything.
Ready to go. And they're off in the Kentucky Derby. And Personal Hope, there goes Storm Tower now quickly on the inside. And Rick Wilson says Storm Tower is expected in the front. Personal Hope up the challenge on the outside. Rockamundo is right there. And Corby with a quick burst of early speed is fourth on the outside. Toss of the coin is fifth. Union City saving ground tucked in with the green camp on the rail. Then comes Dixieland Heat. Bull in the Heather. El Bacan. Diazo on the outside of the white cap. Michielo saving ground along the inside. Wild Gale is next, followed by Sea Hero, then Silver of Silver. Walenda is fifth from the back of the pack. Then there's the favorite, fourth from Land, Prairie Bayou. After that, it's Truth of It All. Then comes Ragtime Rebel, and Kiss and Chris is 19th and last as they straighten away for the run down the backstretch. And the leaders on the inside, Storm Tower leading at by 3/4 of a length. Gary Stevens inching up on the outside with Personal Hope. Toss of the coin is right there between horses. Corby on the far outside is racing third, and Rockamundo with Cal Farrell is fifth along the inside rail. Union City is now off the fence and 4 wide and moving up quickly, followed by Bull in the Heather. Randy Romero in tight quarters there with the red cap and the Dixieland Heat. And the Sea Hero looks for a little racing room. Now on the outside, Personal Hope puts ahead in front. Storm Tower on the inside is second. Corby is right there. And as you can see, Diazo swings to the outside, and Union City with the green cap joining the leaders at the top of the stretch. It's Personal Hope, and he hasn't been asked for his big run. And here comes potential winner of the Kentucky Derby. See Hero.
I don't remember going to the winner's circle. You're just in another world. It's the nicest thing to get to the winner's circle and greeted by a lot of friends, and of course the governor and Tom Meeker, and it's a thing you never forget.
The rain held off, and congratulations on another great show. The rain held off, and today I'm just so pleased.
It's a mystique connected with it. If you haven't seen it, you can't realize how much impact it has. And it's the first time that all 3-year-olds really get together to test which is the best on that particular first Saturday in May.
The Kentucky Derby is much more than just another horse race. It is even more than the greatest 2 minutes in sports. In the end, the Kentucky Derby is 1,000 stories of human beings and horses striving against impossible odds for a fleeting moment in the winner's circle. It is not the winning, it is the striving. And in that striving glows a spark of the divine.
I think out in the field, even as babies, you see horses with competitive nature. Generally, you'll hear a story like he was always out in front of the pack and he never let any of them go by him. And I think that competitive nature starts in horses right from the beginning.
You wake up every morning with the expectation of finding some bum that can run. And a lot of times it happens. I think the excitement in our life is the 2-year-olds. They're unknown, and you fool with them from October of their yearling year right up through the November the following year, and that's the future of racing.
Part of the thing about spring that always captivates me and captivated horse people is the thrill of possibly finding another great horse. And some of us are blessed to see them, ride them. Some people own them. To be involved in any way with a great animal, a great racehorse, is a special blessing. For an American, there's no greater race to win. The focus is on the Kentucky Derby. And the day after the Derby's over, everybody starts looking for the 2-year-olds that might win the Derby next year.